Well, I hope you all are having a wonderful Thanksgiving. We are continuing on in our study through 2 Timothy. I think we may conclude this in the next several days. I want to look at the names at the end of 2 Timothy, verses 9 through 15. Starting at verse 9, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. And Tychicus have I sent to Ephesus. The cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, when thou comest, bring with thee, and the books, but especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works, of whom be thou ware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words." So ends the reading of our text. Paul, it's not all that uncommon. He's done this before, but he mentions a lot of names. Demas forsook him. Crescens departed to Galatia. Titus departed to Dalmatia. Luke was the only one remaining with Paul. Paul asks Timothy to bring Mark because he's profitable. Tychicus, sent by Paul to Ephesus. Alexander the coppersmith in verse 14. Paul warns Timothy against him. And in addition to these 7 individuals, Paul is also writing to Timothy, which makes 8 people who are subjects or recipients of the communication within this specific section, verses 9 through 15. So, if you were counting the people mentioned by Paul in the third person, it is 7 names. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just names. I think we tend to, and the reason for that is because we tend to kind of just brush over or skip over or rush through a reading of names. We seem to have a tendency to do that for some strange, odd reason. Like it's boring, or like with the genealogies. So in verses 16 through 22, Paul mentions 8 more individual names. We're looking at a lot of names. Prisca, often referred to as Priscilla. Achaia, the husband of Prisca. They were fellow tent makers. Onesiphorus, Paul sends greetings to his household. Paul states that Erastus abode at Corinth. Trophimus, Paul leaves him sick at Miletus. It would be really a lot of heavy work, leg work, to run around and look at each individual lives and try to understand how it fits into the context. I'm going to do something a little bit different, not because I'm lazy, but I'm going to show you what I see in this. Paul sends greetings to these people. But it's not, as I've mentioned many times, we're not looking at the logic or the reasoning of Paul. We're looking at the Holy Spirit. And that's very important. I hope you hold that in mind. I want you to hold that in mind as we go through these texts, because Paul just merely held the pen, and it's the Holy Spirit's love letter to us. And I hope to show you just how much love is in this passage. It seems boring because it's just a bunch of names. This part of the chapter acts as Paul's final personal farewell. And it outlines or details his circumstances and the state of his friendships at the end of his life. This final section, and I could conclude, I think, our study in 2 Timothy here today, if I wanted. It is rich. This section is rich in personal detail, highlighting Paul's immediate situation, his loyal friends, his disappointing departures, and the greetings from the believers in Rome. Rather than focusing on each individual, though, I would like to explore the wonder of these 17, I guess, names, give or take a name or two. I think I counted right. 17 people as a whole, from the perspective that it reveals God's personal and intimate interest in these people, that they are not just a list of names. Okay? That's what I want to concentrate on. Focusing on the entire list of 17 names reveals a profound truth. The chapter is a testament to the personal, intimate, and human dimension of God's work carried out through the specific relationships of real people, not abstract concepts. The final words of Paul are not theological treatises or grand commands, but a detailed set of personal requests and greetings. This section is a window into the reality that the early church was built on specific individuals with lives who had problems, they had flaws, they had needs, and they had relationships. Relationships that mattered to God. The names aren't a mere roster. They are a network of relationships that were essential to Paul's life and ministry, and by extension, to the spread of the gospel. God cares about community. We see companionship and intimacy. Only Luke is with me, he says. That is a deeply personal statement of loyalty and comfort. God placed one faithful friend by Paul's side in his final moments. Reconciliation and forgiveness in Mark. Paul asks for Mark to be brought to him. A man who had previously deserted them. We know that from Acts chapter 15. This request models redemption and reconciliation, God's central work in a concrete relationship. There was partnership in service. Prisca and Aquila. Paul greeting these two acknowledges them as essential partners who risked their lives for Paul. Romans chapter 16, verse 34, or verse 3 and 4. Their practical work, tent making, and spiritual work, teaching, were equally valued. We're looking at the sacredness, folks, of the mundane. God's interest extends to the most ordinary details of your life and mine, showing that the physical and material are not separate from the spiritual. Paul's request for his clothes, I love this. He's in a cold dungeon. It's cold. He requests his cloak, his books and parchments, especially the parchments. Isn't that interesting? Paul had a need for study materials. The God who cares about Paul's soul also cares about his need for warmth and access to the Scriptures, but it's especially the parchments. And how often have I said this word is so important? The notes about Trophimus being sick and Erastus staying in Corinth are personal status reports. They show Paul treating these men as more than ministerial tools. Their health and location mattered to Paul, and they were worth including in an inspired letter. The list encompasses a full range of human experience, reminding us that God works with and around imperfect people. Please don't miss that. Please don't miss that fact. There was pain of desertion. Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. That's a heartbreaking detail. It validates the pain of betrayal, while at the same time demonstrating God's tolerance for disobedience, even when it leads to spiritual failure. The warning of opposition. Alexander, the coppersmith. That shows that God cares about Paul's safety and the protection of Timothy's ministry and Timothy's flock. God is intimately involved in both rewarding good and addressing evil. The fact that this list of 17 people who experienced everything from faithful companionship and practical needs to sickness, betrayal, and opposition is preserved as the final testament of Paul. It just makes the entire passage a profound statement. It affirms that God's plan unfolds through the messy personal lives of individuals, each individual life, a precious subject of his attention. So where do you place yourself in all this? The mark that Paul asked Timothy to bring in 2 Timothy is almost universally accepted by tradition and scholars to be the same person as John Mark mentioned in the book of Acts, the traditional author of the Gospel of Mark. That's wonderfully important from the perspective of God's intimate interest in people. We know all about the story of redemption. Most Christians do. You ought to if you are a Christian. And second chances. The mark that Paul mentions, and take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry, is a testament to growth and forgiveness. Early in Paul's ministry, we know from, if we go back to Acts chapter 13, John Mark deserted Paul and Barnabas during their first missionary journey. This was a significant failure that led to a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, causing them to part ways. Years later, I don't know how many years, but years later, Paul, now he's in prison. He's facing death. And what does he do? He requests Mark's presence. Paul's final assessment, if you want to call it that, of Mark is that he's now profitable. He's now useful. And to me, this demonstrates that God's work is not limited by human mistakes or past failures. Mark's life shows that grace and mentorship, likely from Barnabas, his cousin, and Peter, led to his maturity, turning turning a deserter into a valued partner for the apostle in his final days. In his final days. Think about that. A church tradition, stemming from early figures like Papias and Irenaeus, holds that Mark wrote his gospel based on the eyewitness accounts and the preaching of the apostle Peter. Okay, Peter even refers to him as Marcus, my son. If you go over to 1 Peter and look in chapter 5, verse 13, Marcus, my son. And this connects the mark of 2 Timothy directly to the earliest written account of Jesus' life, meaning the man who failed Paul early on eventually became the scribe for Peter, preserving the gospel for all time. Please don't miss that. The specific request in 2 Timothy 4 is one of the final pieces of evidence that Paul and Mark were fully reconciled, validating Mark's faithfulness in completing his incredible journey from failure to fulfillment. The event that caused the split between Paul and Barnabas is clearly stated in Acts. The division over Mark, the division between Paul and his longtime partner Barnabas occurred as they were planning their second missionary journey. That happened somewhere around 50 AD, 80, 50, 49, 50 AD, somewhere thereabouts. In Barnabas' view, he wanted to take John, also called Mark, with him. Barnabas, who was Mark's cousin and a son of encouragement. He prioritized redemption and a second chance for his younger relative. Paul's view, the pragmatist, Paul didn't think it very smart to take the guy because he had deserted them, and he didn't continue on with them in the work that they were doing. Paul prioritized reliability and dependability for the difficult and dangerous missionary work that they had lying ahead. And this led to a sharp, I'd say that puts it mildly, a very sharp disagreement. The word is paroxysmos or something similar. I don't usually pronounce these words all the time. Paroxysmos, suggesting intense emotional contention. Where that they couldn't reconcile their differences, and which resulted in them parting ways. The result of the split, was Barnabas took Mark and sailed to his home country of Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and traveled through Syria and Cilicia. And ironically, this conflict led to 2 missionary teams instead of 1. Get this. Resulting in the gospel being spread to a wider area more quickly. Can you believe that? I hope that doesn't escape your notice. While the reason for the division is clear, Paul's refusal to take Mark back, the Bible doesn't state Mark's specific motivation for leaving the first missionary journey in the first place. Luke simply records that when Paul and his companions arrived at Perga, John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem, and many scholars have suggested several possibilities for why Mark left. Well, the work was too hard, too tough a job. The mission was moving from, the relatively safe coast into the rugged, dangerous mountain regions of Antioch. So the physical hardships may have really just been too much, for the younger Mark. And others say, well, he was homesick. Mark had strong ties to the Jerusalem church. His mother's home was a gathering place for believers, which was common back in the early church days. Some strongly suggest that there was a theological disagreement, that Mark may have been uneasy with Paul's strong focus on preaching to Gentiles, which began to dominate the mission after they left Cyprus. And at this point, the text shifts from mentioning Barnabas and Saul to Paul and his companions. Acts chapter 13, verse 13. 13:13. So there was a shift in leadership, and probably likely a result of tension. But ultimately, the reason for Mark's initial failure is left to speculation. The power of the story lies in the fact that Paul and Mark were fully reconciled later in life. And you got to see, folks, the forgiveness and restoration in that. So the division, this is what amazes me. Here we're looking at a division, and yet the division actually resulted in the gospel being spread to a wider area more quickly. Isn't that interesting? And today we look at that, we go, oh man, what a mess. I think we often just forget that, there's a God in the picture here at work in us, both the will and do of his good pleasure. That is absolutely one of the most interesting and encouraging takeaways that I can see from that conflict I'm almost speechless. I don't have words. Because Christians tend to look so down on all of that junk. But this demonstrates a powerful principle, folks. God can use human disagreement, conflict, even failure to advance his greater unified purpose. That's just a fact. So why are we walking with our head down all the time? God is sovereign over every conflict in our lives. The division between Paul and Barnabas, while emotionally painful and sharp, had outcomes for the mission. It doubled the effort. Instead of having one team covering one route, the sharp disagreement resulted in two effective missionary teams setting out almost simultaneously. Now think about how that same principle is actively at work in your life and mine. Where the churches are strengthened, as churches are established in Syria and Cilicia, and then where they press on into new territory in Asia Minor and eventually into Europe and Macedonia. I pray you don't miss this. It's so easy, folks, to read through this. And we're getting to the end of 2 Timothy. It's been a great study. We're at the end. He's just mentioning a bunch of names. So what, Get out of that mindset, folks. That's not how we study this book. If that's all you want to see in it, that's fine. I'm pointing out something better. That split ensured that Mark remained in ministry. If Paul had prevailed, Mark might have been completely sidelined and discouraged. And we see Barnabas' persistence, driven by relationship and encouragement. He was instrumental in restoring Mark. And this restoration was vital because Mark went on to be Peter's interpreter and the author of the second gospel. Paul needed a new partner, leading him to choose Silas. He was a respected leader from the Jerusalem church. Silas proved to be a steadfast, a good companion. He played a critical role in the foundational churches of Philippi and Thessalonica. In short, a situation that seemed like a failure of partnership actually became a moment where God, the monarch of all eternity, the supreme sovereign God of all eternity, it actually became a moment where God diversified the ministry, restored a future gospel writer, and introduced new leadership, all for the sake of spreading the message to a wider area more quickly. More quickly. So, we go back, we read the biblical genealogies if we can brave ourselves enough to do so. So and so begat so and so, begat so and so, begat so and so, and boy, is that boring. I'm just never realizing, folks, that this is just another profound example of God's personal, intimate concern for individuals with His grand, sweeping narrative. I mean, on the surface, lists like those in Genesis or Chronicles or the opening chapters of Matthew and Luke can seem dry or tedious. I admit that. But folks, when you look at them through the lens of God's individual interests, they become vibrant with meaning. We're looking at proof of God's commitment to specific people. How committed do you think He is to you? And these genealogies are fundamentally about accountability. In history, they assure us that the story of salvation isn't a myth, but an event rooted in real history with real people. There's no abstraction. God didn't save humanity as some abstract concept. No. He called and worked through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the names serve as anchors, proving that Jesus was specifically, historically, and legally descended from David and Abraham, which was fulfilling the prophecies. Every name, every single name in the list represents a life lived, choices made, and a specific link in the chain leading to the Messiah. And for God to meticulously record the lineage shows that the life of Boaz or Jesse was just as vital to His plan as the life of David or Solomon. We want to think we'll sit around and go, man, I'm not as worthy as or as valuable to God as Moses was, or whoever. The most powerful genealogies, particularly Matthew's, they are not sterile lists because they deliberately include individuals whose lives were messy, scandalous, unfaithful at times. Names of women like Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, the wife, of Uriah. These were women who were often foreigners or women connected to controversy. Their inclusion reveals God's sovereignty working through unexpected, imperfect, and diverse individuals. Dearly beloved, this says to me we're not just a number on a list of names with God, but that He's deeply concerned with us all individually. It's the core difference between a cold, bureaucratic approach and a deeply relational one. You are not a number, but a name. And you're not just a name. You know, the Bible consistently rejects the idea that people are disposable or interchangeable numbers in some, I don't know, cosmic ledger. Instead, it asserts that God is intimately concerned with every single person individually. And you cannot strike your name from that list. And this is from Genesis to the Gospels, from the Gospels all through Paul's teaching and all the way to the end. Your life is not an accident in the grand scheme. Or it's not you're not a, I don't know. You may think that you're just sitting on the bench. You're not. You're not. I think of Adam, God creating Adam and breathing life into him. He didn't create a generalized mass, but just one man. He could have just created 1 million people all at once, but no, it was one. To begin this whole process, he picked a nation to begin the nation of Israel. Psalm 147, verse 4 states that God tells the numbers of the stars. He calls them all by name. Now, if he names every star in the universe, how much more does you think he knows and cares about you? Someone who he made in his own image? Jesus said the very hairs on your head are all numbered. That detail highlights God's continuous individual awareness of every person. So the final chapter of Paul's life is a microcosm of this truth. The list of 17 people shows that for Paul, and by extension for God, it shows a person's individual condition matters. It teaches us that God cares about us, that we matter to him even in our darkest time. Demas forsaking God's concern. Even the spiritual decline marks, profitability, and then his profitability. Folks, there's a timing to everything in your life. One of the problems that many Christians have today is they look at someone else and we compare ourselves with one another. So we see someone else and we see how wonderful they're doing, and we should be the same. You're not a copycat of someone else. You are an individual growing in grace and knowledge of Christ, and you are growing to maturity at God's pace and at God's timing. You weren't left on your own to try to catch up with somebody else. And in our normal everyday lives, and in many ways, we often feel as if we are a number. We're treated as if we're just a number. The feeling of being just a number, that's a common human experience in the modern world. Yet it starkly contrasts with the biblical truth that we're seeing. I was a number in the military. That's, anybody that's been in the military. If you've been in prison, you're a number. If you're standing in line at the IRS or wherever, you're a number. If you go to some places, order a hamburger, they'll give you're a number. Okay, it's just Social Security number, tax ID, credit score. I don't know. Yeah, you're just a number. The government probably views you as more of a number. But God is not a government, and God doesn't view you as a number. He knows you by name. And our worth can sometimes feel tied to productivity or financial metrics. We are an employee ID, a case number, a patient number. We're going to the hospital, or a patient number. You know, these are necessary, I'll admit, you know, for how all that works, but it strips away the unique identity of the person. We are reduced to user data, an IP address, or an algorithm's input. Our behavior is tracked and categorized, often without regard for our personal context or identity. And that experience naturally creates the feeling that our unique identity, our personal struggles, and our specific needs are overlooked in favor of the smooth functioning of the machine. But then there's the biblical narrative. The wonder of the biblical perspective is that it offers a total rejection of the just a number idea. The details about the 17 people in 2 Timothy 4, the names and the genealogies and the meticulous attention of God all point to the truth that personal identity is supremely important to God. Known by name, not by category. The ultimate expression of God's intimate concern is that he calls us by name. We see that in the Old Testament. We see it in the New. He told Moses, I know you by name, and you found favor in my sight. That's what he told Moses. Jesus said the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name. I mean, look, folks, don't read over these names so quickly without stopping to consider why the God, the Holy Spirit, put those names here for us. I don't have the words to express the intimacy that's involved in the mention of these names. You're not just a number, but a person of infinite worth in his eyes. So I will conclude this with on the following note. If I were the only human on earth, Jesus would have came and died in my place. And I think that pretty much encapsulates the truth of God's individual, immeasurable love for me and every one of you who belong to him. It is a truth regarding the principle of sufficiency, the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice, and the personal nature of redemption. Jesus Christ's sacrifice, as I've pointed out thousands of times, was substitutionary as it regards his children. It was sufficient, it was perfect, it was necessary for our redemption. And it emphasizes that the magnitude of Christ's love is so vast and so focused that it is equivalent to him having just come and died, and if you had been the only one, just come and die in your place. He would have done it just for you. It strips away the feeling of being a number, and it replaces it with a certainty that you are a singular, beloved recipient of the greatest act of love in all of human history. So while your name today was likely chosen by your parents, I think mine always told me they were watching the Steve Allen show, so they didn't put a lot of thought into it. It proves that names are not arbitrary to God. He can and often does personally intervene to assign a name when it serves a specific redemptive purpose in his plan. Now, so even though the naming is usually human, the overall destiny and purpose associated with your life are ordained by God. Your existence is not accidental. Your suffering is not unnoticed. You're not just a name. Your life is known. Your worth is infinite, and your pain is seen. Look, I love you all. I truly do. Rest in him. Until next time, thanks for listening.